Hello, all, and I welcome you here with James O'Callahan, and we're going to try and gain some insight into a work that he composed for Esprit Orchestra called Not None Other. And James, um, this piece certainly leads us down many interesting pathways, both in terms of multi-dimensional musical activity, but philosophical ideas. And also, it, it seems to be a play on elusivity. Um,
Hmm.
I think that that comes first and foremost from a title that it's not exactly a double negative, but it's a triple negative, or it's, I mean, what is the none other? Um, or could this be called not anything but? Or
Right.
like what? How do you get a handle on that concept? First of all, we can discuss the orchestra and all kinds of other things about the piece, but that in itself makes you think. And in fact, as the piece progresses, I found that there was a lot of room for contemplation in the piece.
Hmm.
Um, it's built into the experience, but again, the title itself leads to that contemplation and how you put sound and ideas together. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure, of course. Um, yeah, so I guess the title comes from a text by a Buddhist philosopher named Chandrakirti. It's like a 7th century text called Guide to the Middle Way. And I have it handy here. Just I'll read a little excerpt from it just to show the context of where that title, Not None Other, came from. So they're talking about the self. The self is like a cart, which is not other than its parts, not non-other, and does not possess them. It is not within its parts, and its parts are not within it. It is not the mere collection, and it is not the shape. So like we've all heard the expression like something that's more than the sum of its parts, or is it the sum of its parts? And so that line of questioning for me in this piece really came from a confrontation with the idea of the orchestra, because it's quite an overwhelming thing. It's large. It's the largest ensembles in music. There are many people involved in creating sound together in an orchestra. And so just that being confronted with this vast force, my immediate reaction to the idea of writing a piece for orchestra is kind of like, well, what is it? You know, what is an orchestra? So you mentioned kind of there are a lot of philosophical ideas in the piece, and I think that that's rather typical for me, is that when I start to work on a piece, I really start to go on down these kind of conceptual roads, trying to think philosophically about the context of the music and the music. And so with the idea of an orchestra being something that has many different parts, every instrument has lots of different parts that put it together, and nonetheless we can say this is a bassoon, and there are many different instruments and different people making sound together, and all these different ways of dividing it up, and yet it's still one thing. So that's the initial kind of avenue of inquiry into the piece. It's really about ontology, like what is stuff. So that's the kind of the main contemplation of the piece, which is a very big topic, of course, but this thinking of something being itself, but also being other things, composed of other things. So it's not just that, it's also other things, but it's also not those things. You know, an orchestra is a violin,
There you
two
go.
violins, a bassoon, a trombone,
There you
etc. So
go. Not none other. Um,
yeah.
but it's also interesting that built into the orchestra in this case are electroacoustic sounds and
Mm-hmm.
sounds from other environments other than the concert hall, and the use of space in terms of the concert hall space, but space that's created by a multi-channel loudspeaker system, and So the orchestra is extended beyond the normal acoustic instruments of the orchestra in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, that seems to be an interesting aspect of the piece as well, that the orchestra is more than the orchestra.
Right. So I guess, I mean, that ties into that same avenue of inquiry. So that orchestra is itself, it is those instruments, but also kind of problematizing that and looking at the sound of the orchestra being transformed or being compared to other sounds that come from outside of the concert hall. So there's this kind of like, is a bassoon still a bassoon if it's not on stage, you know, if it's outside and somebody's taking a walk and they have it in their case, you know? So the instruments have different contexts in which they can exist. The people who play them have different contexts in which they exist. So having an orchestra play on stage, making those sounds that the instruments are capable of making it, also can be situated in a context where we think about those other situations that those people and those instruments are in. So to me, it's something I do a lot in my music, is kind of drawing on sounds from the outside or from the inside in different contexts outside of the concert hall. I like to try to connect the kind of aesthetic world, which is supposed to be this imaginary realm beyond our human lives, to that very human experience. And so electronics for me always has that element of kind of humanizing the music by bringing it into sounds that we recognize from our lives, thinking about maybe personal memories that we might have attached to sounds that we recognize. And so I work with that a lot in my music in general, but really looking at this orchestral context allowed me to play with that in different ways. So it was really, I feel very fortunate that with the piece we had the chance to do a big multi-channel setup. So there are 8 loudspeakers around the audience, which also extends that space of like the orchestra is the thing that happens on stage, but then there's also the hall itself becomes a site for sound through the multi-channel configuration surround sound, and also through situating a microphone in front of the orchestra. And yes, just one single microphone in front of an entire orchestra. That was really my initial seed for the piece, was this image popped into my head of like big electronic setup, big instrumental setup, lots of instruments, lots of speakers, and then one little microphone between them, kind of being the sort of diplomat in between the instrumental and the electronic world. And the kind of irony of that, it's almost like the beginning of the piece is a joke. It's like,
Well, you'll recall that I was shocked when you produced the one microphone, and I thought,
yeah.
we have all these resources here. We have 8 loudspeakers around the hall.
Yeah.
And, you've got one microphone. And normally you would think, well, there would be many microphones, and you would be able to mix all of the different sounds from different parts of the orchestra and create shapes and textures that way. But explain a little bit about how that microphone is used, and also the use of a particular chord that appears in the piece from Stravinsky,
Yeah.
and its relationship to Western culture and musical culture in a way.
Totally.
And I mean, not only just classical musical culture, but pop culture too. And it's interesting that there is this bridge.
So I think just first to say that the choice of microphone too, like it's not only that I'm only using one microphone, I decided to use like an SM58, very iconic microphone that's used normally for voice. So it's completely like the wrong microphone to use if you were going to use one microphone to record an orchestra, which is very silly anyway. But I wanted to tie into this idea of the orchestra being a thing, one thing. So do you put a one microphone in front of one thing kind of thing, or do you put multiple microphones in front of things? So I wanted this kind of visual setup, but also this oral setup where you're kind of reducing a big wall of sound into something that can be captured in one small little space. And that idea really connects to then what I do with the microphone and the opening measures of the piece, which is sort of very fast real-time version of the process that is the subject of the work I Am Sitting in a Room by Marion Alvin Lucier, where Alvin Lucier records his voice in a room, and then it's recorded and played back in that same room many, many times until all of the spectral content of the voice slowly gets diminished into, at the end, a single frequency and then silence. So the acoustic of the room takes over more and more of the sound and thins out into nothingness. And so I thought that that was a really poignant expression of this idea of the orchestra. What is it? Is it many things? Is it one thing? And situating it within the space and letting the space of the concert hall take over. So the opening measures of the piece are just one chord that's recorded, played back immediately afterward, and then that is recorded and played back until you get this kind of like, almost like a delay line, but it diminishes in frequency content over time. So there's this disappearance, this maybe the illusory quality that you were referring to in the introduction. And that chord is, as you mentioned, from Stravinsky, from the Firebird. And it's just this big bow. And that chord was sampled as one of the samples contained in the Fairlight CMI synthesizer, which is a synthesizer made in the late 70s, the first widely commercially available sampling synthesizers. So you had recorded sounds that you could trigger with the push of a keyboard. And so this particular sample became really widely used in popular music, and it's known as the orchestra hit. So you hear a lot in like hip hop music in particular, dance music. You get a lot of, in the 1980s, early 90s, it was very popular, almost to the point of becoming a cliche. This sound that, to me, I guess, from my own background of like not really being involved in classical music growing up, and that's around the time that I was growing up, this is the sound that is like, that's an orchestra. You know, if you had to have a really iconic like image of the orchestra immediately, like it's not only the sound of an orchestra, it conveys the orchestra. So when I hear it, I think of the orchestra. And so I really wanted something for the piece that it's like, you hear it, and it's like, okay, that's an orchestra. That's what they sound like, that's what they do. So I wanted something really kind of connected to the classical tradition in that way, coming from Stravinsky and then being repurposed and diluted and dissolved into something else.
I think you used the term bottled orchestra at one point.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But that's kind of a restrictive bottling of the orchestra, one chord. So how did you expand the concept of the orchestra from that one chord? I mean, we've talked about the elements, but how do you diverge from that chord? How to build the layers of the piece? And then how did you decide upon the layers and then the external elements or the variegated elements that comprise
Yeah, I think like if I was like a purely conceptual composer, like capital C, like maybe what I would have done with the piece is just have that chord played over and over again and that process happened for 15 minutes. But I'm also someone who has a very playful imagination and really loves sound and hearing new sounds. And so I let my imagination get carried away with me when I have a starting point like that. And then I do a kind of free association to other kinds of things that I'm thinking about and other connections that spring off of that idea. So my first kind of follow-up question to the initial question that I posed through that process was, can we simulate that process that's done electroacoustically of the space kind of taking over and things dissolving into a single frequency? Can I do that with orchestration? So in the opening measures of the piece, you have this electronic process, then the microphone's turned off and the orchestra starts repeating this chord, but each time the orchestration changes and thins out. So you have this kind of orchestral convolution of that chord turning into other things and becoming pure in frequency content. And I just kind of go from there. So then it diverges into this idea of the orchestra being compared with other things from the outside world. And so as the texture thins out, it starts to transform and manipulate into sounds that are derived from the outside world. So you have like a kind of I think the first one is sort of a street sing. You hear bells and birds and a car going by and these kinds of things. So it's just immediately, the concert hall is so present in the beginning of the work because the acoustic is reinforcing itself. It's really like the piece is about the space that you're in. And then we do a pivot, and this is the space that you're not in. And so there's like questioning of everything that one's presented with as the means of unraveling the kind of principal interrogation of the piece.
And is that somehow related to concepts of Asian philosophy or Zen or?
I mean, because I was really interested in the writings of Chandrakirti and thinking about their work, of course, those ideas influence it. It's also something that's been picked up much later in Western philosophy. Like, I think the Chandrakirti text is 7th century, and then there's an 18th century text by David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, where he's talking about bundle theory, which is more or less the same thing that Chandrakirti is talking about. So lots of different philosophical ways of framing this same fundamental problem, which is, what is the self? What are we? They're like very core kind of philosophical questions. What are things? Like, what is ontology? Like, what is stuff? So I think people from many different cultures and over many different eras have posed this question in different ways. And so one of those windows into that question, which is ultimately very personal, was through the Chandrakirti text. So that certainly influenced me, but I wasn't thinking about it beyond that in terms of deriving material or context for the work.
I think it's really interesting that the lines between orchestral sound or orchestral composition purely and these other elements, both the transformational ones electroacoustically and bringing in other sounds from outside the orchestra, these lines are blurred, but they are not incompatible. There's no sense of incompatibility within the piece. There's a unity to it, which sometimes in various compositions, things are thrown together and they don't add up. And I didn't get that sense in your piece. And of course, I know that there's a dedication of this work. There's a very personal matter involved. You could speak about that a little bit.
It happens to be that as I was composing the work, my father passed away from brain cancer. And so that I was, he was suffering through it as I was working on the piece, and then ultimately died pretty shortly before I finished the work. And so when something that significant is happening in one's personal life, it's bound, of course, to affect in some way or another one's artistic life or professional life. And so that I was already thinking about these things, like what is the self, and this idea of disappearance. It became very poignant for me in thinking about my father, and also through our relationship and his way of looking at the world, which was very kind of stoic, and he was also very interested in Buddhism, and really was my first point of contact in the world with philosophy and thinking about the world in different ways. And so a lot of the conversations that I had with my father about life and death worked their way into my thinking in the piece.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, thank you very much for joining us and giving some insights into your work. And we are certainly looking forward to hearing more of your music and the evolution of ideas that may spring from this piece and develop in other works. So thank you again. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
A pleasure. Bye now.
Take care. Be well.